One of the most common questions I've got asked over the years, probably more than anything I've ever received, is the question of approach anxiety. It's a big problem for many men. Uh, there's no status behind it. I mean, it could be, very high value, otherwise very high value man who has his act together and, has everything going for him in business, and everything in between. And it could be, a man who is just starting out, but, is finding it difficult to navigate um, those pitfalls, let's say. How do you really overcome approach anxiety in a way which is productive, but also long lasting and effective? Because, the ways many men go about it is usually ineffective. What do I mean by that? You see, a lot of men, they approach women on the basis of very direct desire, right? They're very unstrategic, let's say. There's no real purpose behind it other than a very shallow lust. Approach anxiety, what it arises from is nothing more than inexperience mostly. It is very much a numbers game to what I was speaking about in my previous video with regards to dating apps, etc. Approach anxiety is merely a lack of experience, which usually results in a lack of confidence as well. So the way you combat that is by putting in the reps, as I've said before. Um, and I think there's a reason why so many men struggle with this. I've been writing online probably for the last 10 years, and one of the most common problems is always this question of, oh, I don't know what to say, or I'm getting paralyzed the moment I go up to a woman who is otherwise attractive. There is always this notion of, what if everything goes wrong and I'm stuck there, with this sense of embarrassment in front of the woman who I actually wanted to get with, right? To pursue. The idea is that for most men, this comes from a scarcity mentality. What do I mean by that? Is that a man who knows what he's doing, understands the nature of female desire in the grand scheme, that because it is a numbers game, you can't really have a 99% success rate on every approach you do. And I've always advocated for this rule of thumb. This has been the philosophy I've shared over the years, and I completely endorse to this day. You first overcome approach anxiety by getting out there and exposing yourself. The first thing you have to do is overcome approach anxiety through merely exposing yourself to the very thing which you fear, which is going up to a woman. Because believe me, if you go up to 100 women, the sting of the possibility of rejection is going to alleviate. It can't really persist with such a strong effect for such a long time. It's very much the same as if you are going to do 100 sales scores, for instance. You're going to start picking up things along the way, whether those are hints or suggestions that start to point you in the right direction. You see? So after you get those reps in, there is merely no point in approaching women for the sake of approaching women, unless a woman is head over heels for you, is giving you the right signals. You can discern certain social cues which are giving you a green light. The more experience you have, the more calibrated approaches you make, and the less you cold approach women. And by cold approach, I mean approaching women under no sexual attraction basis. So you haven't really received all the social cues that a woman is necessarily into you. You're just merely building up the reps to increase your self confidence and actually overcome that fear which you are facing. After that roadblock is overcome, however, doing more calibrated approaches, which are driven by the signals which the woman is communicating to you, 90% of the time through her body language, eye contact, um, and the likes, then, only then on, your probability, your success rate will absolutely skyrocket in comparison, because that is no longer a cold approach. That is then a warm approach. So this is basically like the difference between having a cold lead and a warm customer who's seen your work, extracted value from you already, and is now qualifying themselves. You see, so the anxiety part of initially approaching women, however, there are certain hacks you can implement in the process to make the pre-approach, let's say, a bit more bearable. But this is not to say that you will completely eliminate, the sting of fear or of nerves. Anyone who guarantees to you that you won't feel any of those, that spectrum of emotion, is merely deceiving you, because part of it is also a motivator. It's like a driving force. It's pushing you forward. You only have a few seconds, when you see a woman you're attracted to actually go up to her and speak to her. After those few seconds, the probability that you won't do it is very, very high. So it is a matter of accountability largely as well. That's why people seek out mentors and people who can point them in the right direction and hold them accountable. They have a wall against their back, let's say. Then your motivator for action is that much more pronounced. So the other thing is, of course, when you're going up to a woman, many men overthink, what they're gonna say and how to say it and this and that. It's really, those are micro details in the grand scheme of things, because when a women in general, they want to be approached. Don't get it twisted, because you hear it a lot, in common culture now, present culture. A lot of men are afraid of looking like creeps, basically, and therefore they have all these negative associations around approaching women. So they're trying to speak to her as if she's lifted up on a pedestal above their heads, when the reality is that if you spoke to women with the same normalcy and common decency that you would speak to a man who's your friend, you can't possibly look like a creep that easily. The problem is that men go into it and approach it with already a lot of negative beliefs and preconceptions that they've heard of getting me too, essentially. Um, you know, it is a valid concern. However, it's not as big as you usually make it out to be if your intention is clear. So, if you know what the purpose is behind your approach, why you are doing this, you genuinely want to build self confidence and move in the direction of understanding and listening mostly. Because if you approach a woman under the intention of boasting about yourself and communicating some kind of arrogance, your probability of rejection is going to compound. I can assure you of that. You need to have some charisma. Of course, if you're still never have approached a woman before, or you still have a lot of tension behind that, it doesn't have to be more complicated than an observation, for instance, or a question, or even maybe a compliment. However, that could also be a stretch for some men. So sometimes I advise against that. However, don't get so stuck up on what you're going to say. What you should be more stuck up on is whether or not you are committing to the act, right? Whether you're actually approaching. Because the approach itself, regardless of how terrible it goes, and the first few times you do this, it's not going to go your way. I'll be completely honest with you. And you'd be fortunate if you do, because a lot of men are also socially awkward, regardless of their social standing. So you have to take a lot of these factors in mind. The first few times, be it rejection or um, a weird reaction, this is also part of the process. So you don't want to shortcut the process and look for formulas which guarantee that you will never have a negative experience in your life with approaching a woman. This is not the intention at all. It's more about understanding the nature of approaching, that a rejection in the grand scheme of things is not really that big of a deal. It might seem like a big deal for a moment after it happened, sure. And you can absorb it and internalize it, figure out perhaps what you did wrong and what could be improved. However, getting stuck up on it is really a sign of a man who is inherently unconfident and hasn't realized his value as a man, right? His self worth is still like a mirage to him. It's very blurry. He has basically no outcome independence, which is another word for saying that he is basically so dependent on female validation, on receiving approval or making the woman like him, that he doesn't realize that he has a certain value to communicate to a woman, and that he has a value within himself which far outweighs the validation that he can receive from other people. So it's really important to understand that rejection is crucial, but also not such a big deal. It's not such, people get too hung up on it, and it's not really this horrible thing. Uh, who cares if 10 other women see you get rejected by a woman? I know that idea sounds completely humiliating, and you probably think I'm out of my mind for saying that. However, man who has the guts and the courage to go up to a woman, a very attractive one, and shoot his shot. And, over time, you're going to become very good at that because this is just merely a lack of skill set, as I've said before. And this should be very encouraging to hear, if anything. Yes, there are some men who are more natural at it, sure, who just have like some natural charisma, which, gets a foot in the door, let's say. However, those men also sometimes tend to get lazy with their interactions merely because they already have a sense of advantage. Whereas if you come from, a place of need and understanding and wanting to develop yourself, women can really respect that, and I've heard of men who, for instance, approach a woman and immediately communicate to her, listen, like, I'm quite nervous right now, and um, this is actually the first time I'm doing this, and uh, I just wanted to come and have a chat with you and see how it's going. They put their thoughts out up front as a way to cope with the shittiness of the situation, let's say. Now, there are better approaches to go around that because it's not necessarily the case that you must, divulge your feelings to her on the approach. However, it's important to understand the nature of the approach. The anxiety part is a lack of knowledge. There's not going to be any anxiety behind approaching a woman if you know what a woman responds to and what you're all about. If you've internalized your self worth and the intimidation around the surroundings, the atmosphere of approaching has completely softened down, which usually happens naturally when you've done it a lot of times, then you're going to get high mental clarity of the situation. And it's just going to be like, going on a phone call. It's not really um, intimidation then or nerves. And nerves could be a very good thing as well, because, you can approach a woman, a very beautiful woman, right? And having a bit of nerves actually improves the overall experience at the end, makes it more memorable even. The adrenaline you get from it. It could be a driving force instead of something that holds you back, you see? It's all a matter of perspective in the end. You know, one of my mentors early on always used to say, you know, anxiety is nothing more than laughter seen from a different point of view. What does that mean? It's like you can reframe anxiety as a source of excitement rather than as a source of paralysis. And it could be a driving force, literally a vehicle for growth. And you can transform yourself through those experiences long term. And all your fears, for example, you know, even recording yourself in front of a camera, it could be quite uncomfortable if you haven't done it before. You do it a few times, and suddenly you start to get the hang of things a bit. And of course you can shortcut the process. For example, even with speaking to women, if you understand some of the ins and outs of what women really respond to, because women, they're very indirect, so everything is of course very emotional. It's you know if you can create that emotional resonance on that first approach by slipping a slither of vulnerability, for instance, um, having a sense of humility as well, mixed with some charisma, a sense of humor, a certain playfulness, knowing how to play with the tension of the situation. You don't want to push too hard, but you also have to be able to pull at the right time. So the more experience you get, the more cultivated your judgment becomes, and you can be very, very sharp with your timing and how you do this dance with the woman. Whereas if you're inexperienced, you don't really understand the mechanics of it. It's not meant to be something robotic where you're I can't wait till this ends type of thing. It should be exhilarating in a very positive and sexually charged manner. If you go about it and assign a negative connotation to it, it's going to seem like a bore to you. And even worse, you're not really going to extract the wisdom out of it. So, as a very basic rule, if you approach a woman and make either an observation or ask a question, open ended questions which make her think, those tend to work more effectively because, again, they have to think it through. They have to digest it. And the likelihood that you would get a response is much higher than if you had to ask a more close ended question, which could be answered with a yes or no, for instance. So, that, and also just having good manners, right? So, if you've never approached a woman, you're not going to escalate physically, you're not going to touch her, especially if, you're doing it during the day. So, you're not going to escalate physically or get too close to her. You're going to maintain a certain distance to not surprise her. You don't want to surprise a woman if you've never really approached her, because she's just going to get freaked out most likely. So those more calibrated, details, of just not being looking strange and weird in the grand scheme of things. So if you know how to adjust to the environment a bit, beyond speaking to women, of course, you will understand what I'm saying. However, even if you're having some trouble with these things early on, you have to stick to the process because you will adjust and change things from one approach to another. But you have to approach that's the most important part. The perfection of it, that doesn't really matter, because what you're doing is you're developing building blocks of knowledge and wisdom, and they're giving you hints and suggestions of what women really respond to. You see, so you are on a track to acquire experience and understanding of how women really function, the nature of desire. Attraction is very intrinsic. It's not something which you can negotiate most of the time. You can play with people's feelings, sure, and you can manipulate that, but it's not going to serve you well if you do it with malicious intent. Now, if you're doing it for the benefit of you and the woman you are courting, that could be extremely valuable and benevolent for something which is positive. However, if you want to overcome that initial anxiety of approach, you have to stick to the bare minimum, to the bare basics, and get on with it. So, those are some thoughts. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. You can also follow me on X below. So there's 37,000 of you on there. So I receive a lot of messages from many of you who have read my work over the years, and I have to say thank you for the support recently, for all of you who've been watching the videos as well. So you should be expecting more of me very soon. So I'll be posting some more videos in the very near future here. So if you have any suggestions or recommendations, please put them below, and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Have a great day.